So we're going to talk about Romanticism in art and music. Hopefully we'll get both into the same video. So what is significant, of course, is that the characteristics of Romanticism obviously carry over into the art and music, just like they did in literature and poetry. So they're, again, reactionary pieces. They are first off reacting against the Industrial Revolution that was still very much in full force throughout Europe at this period. They're also reacting against previous forms of art, classical art that had many more rules and standards. You're going to see that there is much less rule associated with Romantic art. Um, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't like look at every single piece of romantic art and say, oh, that's romantic because it looks like this. Because they don't follow the rules, you're going to see a lot of variety in romantic art. And the first artist I want to show you is Caspar David Frederic, who's French. Probably his most well-known work of art here is Wandering Above this Sea of Fog, which portrays not only kind of the sublime view of nature, but also the power of the individual as you see here. But I mean, this is a very common theme, obviously portraying the outdoors. You are very far away from a city. Nature can almost be overpowering to a certain extent. It seems as though this man is almost kind of in the heavens. It's a very, very kind of mystical piece. Um, you also see this with morning, but his use of color is a little bit warmer here, probably celebrating the idea of morning, the idea that, you know, that unlike the kind of uncertain future that the Industrial Revolution brings, you see kind of the more certainty that nature seems to always, there is always kind of a guarantee that there will be another day. And just kind of this beauty, the beauty and pastoral nature of this work of art versus, kind of the dirty smokestacks that are represented by the Industrial Revolution. So very celebratory of the outdoors. Cemetery is a little bit more of kind of a religious piece. Really, really interesting, but you could argue that it is also romantic because it is, looking at, it is very much looking at the themes of death. Um, you see that, I mean, first off, there is kind of just the remains of a cathedral here, and then of course these tombs and then these trees that look like they are dead, but at the same time, this is portrayed in winter, so potentially the idea of renewal after the winter is over. So it may again be the idea that even when man has left, if a cathedral has crumbled and these bodies have been buried, that ultimately nature will return. Another really important French artist is Eugene Delacroix. Um, his first very famous work of art is Liberty Leading the People, which is commemorating the 1830 revolutions in France. You can see here, first off, that he is very much interested in very dramatic use of color. Realized that it was the French Revolution that first started using the tricolor flag, very much celebrated here. It's also somewhat controversial because, of course, you see, there's kind of a sexualized image here. The idea that liberty is represented as female also, you could argue, is, a little bit kind of revolutionary in nature. It very much portrays kind of the violence of the 1830 revolutions as well, but overall it's romanticizing it, and it's definitely portraying the uh, the people themselves as victorious, and this idea of liberty as something that is very strong and that ultimately will triumph. You also see, sorry, this is a little bit smaller. This is a portrayal, Massacre at Chios, which was from the Greek Revolution. This is before the Greek victory. This is actually portraying a scene after the Greeks were very brutally slaughtered by the Turks, and it again shows you um, kind of kind of violence, the very much reacting against against what happens at war, but also at the same time, because of course we saw liberty leading the people prior to that, that this is kind of um, this is meant to be kind of celebrating the Greek people. We know ultimately that at the end of the Greek Revolution, the Greeks are victorious. This is meant to kind of evoke emotion to get more people rallied behind the Greek independence cause, because this is in the middle of the Greek independence movement. They have not yet been freed from the Turks. That happens in 1829. A very famous English painter, um, JMW Turner. He is very well known for kind of the awe-inspiring power of nature. He loves to portray things like sinking ships, storms. This, of course, is very much portraying that. It's called Shipwreck, 1823. I mean, you can really barely see the ship here. Instead, you see kind of the violent nature of the waves. Um, kind of very dark and mysterious in the foreground, but also, that there's definitely a representation of sunlight here in the background. And again, it shows you that nature is far more powerful than man. You also see, this is one of my favorites, the Fighting Temeraire, a little bit later, and this is showing actually an older ship that had been, actually, I believe it was in the Battle of Trafalgar, and it's being towed out to a salvage yard by a little tugboat here. And so what this is showing us again is industrialization uh, versus kind of the older, more classical, in this case, a type of ship, right? And I mean, you could argue, some people kind of like to argue two different things about this painting. They like to say, oh, is the sun setting or is the sun rising? Um, and ultimately, it seems as though there are kind of two different meanings to this. This is right around the time that Queen Victoria is taking over in England, so there's kind of a lot of uncertainty about the future. But notice that the tugboat is much darker than the older ship. Notice, of course, that this is a representation of kind of pollution. It is smaller than the ship, which looks very glorious. It definitely has that kind of nostalgic feeling that we see in a lot of romantic paintings. So I would argue that Turner's kind of looking nostalgically at this older ship. John Constable, also English. You can see, so this is what I meant when I said there's like no real way that you can look at all pieces of romantic art and say, oh, these are romantic. You can see that he is much more concerned with kind of celebrating the countryside. Many of his works of art are like this. This is a Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows. And again, you see that there's some romantics are also kind of interested in returning back to religion. You see that with this church that is right in the center. Also, interestingly, a rainbow over the church. Again, definitely kind of celebrating the simplicity of the countryside versus kind of the chaos and dirt of the city. Maybe the idea that such a beautiful pastoral landscape is fleeting and much more difficult to come across. Also, you see this in the Haywain, which again is very much kind of celebrating the countryside, just kind of how slow the day can be in a lot of ways, since we know how terrible agricultural conditions could be for certain people prior to the agricultural revolution. We know that a lot of these works of art are exaggerating to a large extent, so it's important to realize that. Just because they are kind of celebrating and nostalgic doesn't necessarily mean that their work is completely true. Hopefully we'll get through music. I actually plan on playing some of this, I plan on playing some of this music for you in class instead of actually having it on a PowerPoint, because that's a little bit difficult. So again, it is very much connected to emotion, and also you're going to see that some romantic musicians are also very nationalistic. Okay, so they are reacting to the previous musical era, which was classical. One of the most prominent classical artists was Johann Sebastian Bach. So in class, I want to compare some Bach to people like Beethoven. So actually, that's a good bridge to turn to here. Speaking of bridge, Beethoven is definitely seen as kind of the transitional figure between the classical and romantic era. You're going to see when we play his music in class that he's very much going along with some of these romantic themes by not really following the prescribed rules that classical music played. there is much more of an emphasis on minor keys. Um, Classical music was usually using major keys, usually ending with a very harmonic chord. You're going to see a lot more dissonance in Romantic music. And some people, also another thing that's important about not just Beethoven, but a lot of Romantic artists is a lot of them are um, not as constrained by patronage anymore. Remember that patronage was, rich donors basically helping these artists financially while they were producing their works. Beethoven was not as constrained by this, so you can argue that this allows him to be much freer in his compositions. Um, Now, also, you probably know that Beethoven became deaf. Most of his later works were written, of course, when he was deaf, and a lot of people argue that this makes him even that much more um, of a romantic because he's no longer following any previously established rules because he literally can't hear what he's writing anymore. And um, the argument is, or people have said that he was sort of undisturbed by the bustle of life after becoming deaf, and he was free to write music in whatever way he wanted to. Also, he's one of the first composers to incorporate vocal music. Um, and we already talked about Schiller previously. Remember that Beethoven sets Schiller's Ode to Joy to music in the last movement of his ninth century. Few other Romantic musicians to talk about. Frederic Chopin. We will play his funeral march or dirge in class. It very much epitomizes the Romantic era and the idea of emotion. Very, very sad song by Chopin, but good one to mention. Wagner, he is definitely the best representation of nationalism in the Romantic era. He was a German opera composer. He developed what was called the music drama, which we often consider the kind of culmination of the Romantic era. When we think of Wagner, one of the most famous pieces that he wrote was called Ride of the Valkyries, which I will play for you in class. But really, he is a nationalistic composer. He strongly emphasizes German myths and legends in his music. They are very much kind of they definitely kind of portray a military theme. And actually, you're going to find that Hitler celebrated Wagner as his favorite musician. So, why does the Romantic era matter? Well, first off, many romantics were kind of behind the revolutionary movements that we previously talked about because they thought it gave people more freedom and control over their lives. And that makes sense since you know that romantic artists and poets and writers and so on are rejecting previously established rules. So they're kind of going to be against, really authoritative governments or, very conservative, oppressive regimes. They tend to support nationalistic movements, especially those that emphasize cultural traditions and languages of Europe, of all the different people in Europe. This is one of the reasons why Wagner fits so well into the Romantic movement, because remember that Germany was not yet unified. So to have a German nationalistic composer, this starts to inspire the German Confederation to actually solidify and become one country. Um, One of the things that's important to realize, though, is that Romantics they were very much romanticizing revolutionary movements. They were very idealized, and it would probably have been very difficult for them to attain all of their goals in light of the political realities of the era, right? So I mean, basically, like, can the working class take over um, take over a monarchy without and actually successfully be able to establish a new government? It seems very difficult to do that. So I've already been saying it a lot, but by idealizing the revolutionary movements, we use the term romanticizing something a lot. So these artists oftentimes are kind of making this era actually seem much more idealized than it really was. So it's not practical. Um, so that's kind of just a summary of the Romantic art, literature, and music. We're going to actually have an opportunity to look at a lot of this, analyze it much more deeply, and also, of course, listen to some of this music in class.